appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today and to share this webinar with Dr. Sungmin Cho and colleague Dr. Bill Wieninger. I've got several slides that I want to talk about regarding understanding the North Korean nuclear crisis, but I'm happy to start with any comments that you may have in the, you can put them in the chat box. I also would engage if there's things that you think, man, when we finish this 25 minutes together, ought to understand these things about the North Korean nuclear crisis. Go ahead and put them up now. I'm happy to look at them. If not, I'll get more than enough material to talk. I'll look for them as they come in. I think if we're going to talk about the North Korean nuclear crisis, it's well framed in understanding the historical context, denuclearization policies that have been brought forward over the last 30 years, about the regional leaders and their interests, Kim's political symmetry. Sungmin alluded to that a little bit. The economic context, nuclear missile capabilities, and what I see is two divergent futures. Let me see what's coming in the chat. That's an interesting question about how can their nukes be so dangerous if they can't even keep power in their cities. I'm going to talk about that. Let's start with a little bit about the historical context. You know, the Korean Peninsula juts out from the northeast portion of China. It divides the West Sea from the East Sea, or the Yellow Sea from the Sea of Japan, and it is encircled by the regional powers of China, Russia, and Japan. This is as a result of its geopolitical positioning and the things that have come. Korea has found itself to be a historic victim of geopolitical rivalries. Somebody's mic's on. Take it, see if I can address somebody's mic. Okay.
Go ahead, James. I got it.
Thank you for that, Bill. You know, as we look at the while China has been in its ancient history was a suzerain power that executed authority over the suzerain authority on the Korean Peninsula. Korea was successful despite that through mostly diplomatic efforts to be able to maintain its degree of sovereignty, but it still had to defend itself a number of times from China, right? It spent 400 years up until the early 300s being occupied by the Han commanderies. It fought the Sui dynasty in the late 500s. It fought the Tang dynasty in the mid 600s, the Khitans in the late 900s, the Jurchens in the 1100s. Perhaps most difficult was the Mongolian invasion, which went over 100 years from the mid 12 to 1300s. And so it had that relationship with China. And someone spoke about distrust, and it is of China, and it's rooted from ancient history. It then had significant issues in the late 1500s with its Japanese neighbors, fighting the Indian War in 1592 and 1598, finally defeating Toyotomi Hideyoshi's forces with the turtle ships. In 1598, Japan looked inwards for some 250 years, but when Japan was opened up in 1857, you know, it quickly looked to mime everything that was Western, and it would quickly rise as a significant power in this region. The Russians actually moved to the Far East here in 1860 with the Peking Treaty, and they'll go all the way to the Yalu, or excuse me, all the way to Vladivostok, across the Ussuri River, right? And they start taking an interest in this area around that time as well. You'll end up with them moving down into the peninsula with the 1884 Russia-Korea Treaty. Japan, as it tries to dislodge China from a suzerain power, will fight with the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95. You know, the Treaty of Shimonoseki and will not only does it yield Formosa or Taiwan to Japan, but it also gives them in war indemnities Liang Peninsula, which is down where Port Arthur or Dalian is. While the triple intervention precluded Japan from occupying that area, the Russians will move quickly down into that area, and they then now have Vladivostok and they have Liaodong Peninsula with Port Arthur. And the only thing in between it is the Korean Peninsula, which is what you'll end up with the Japanese trying to push Russia out of this area with the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. And so by the time that's done, Japan is clearly the strongest power in this area. You know, they'll occupy the Korean Peninsula as a protectorate in 1905 and then lead to its annexation in 1910 and rule there until the end of the Second World War in 1945. Russia will enter the end of the war. They'll end up occupying the Korean Peninsula in the closing days in August of 45 and secure the Japanese surrender north of the 38th parallel in the U.S. Through agreement will come in the south. And they'll end up with a division that'll end up with the DPRK and the ROK coming into statehood in 1948. 2 years later, less than 2 years later, we'll have the Korean War. 4 million casualties on the Korean Peninsula, right? From all of those that were present. Significant conflict. But from that, in the threat of nuclear or atomic attack, North Korea begins its efforts into learning and understanding about atomic energy. They sign agreements with the Soviets. Soviets will build a light water reactor that'll be completed in '67. And while they refuse to build another reactor, the North Koreans will put online, I guess about December of '85, their 5 megawatt graphite moderated reactor, which has been the source of many of the agreements to bring about the denuclearization of North Korea. These things shape in the mindset of Koreans. Frankly, they on both sides of the DMZ. So, having taken us up to where North Korea begins developing its nuclear program, their program was in fact diminutive compared to South Korea's nuclear weapons program. South Korea will eventually eliminated in the early '80s. We could talk about that in Q&A if you desire. But let's turn our attention to about 1988. And so What's going on is No Tae-woo came to power in South Korea in February of '88. The Olympics are going to happen later that year.
Hey,
He
James,
puts forward, yeah.
before you go into that, there's a comment in the chat, and I know you probably can't see it, but you may want to comment on that while it's still hot.
Let me take a look. Thank you for that. North Korea conventional military campaigns are likely initiating devastating. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah.
So, you know, the question about North Korea's conventional military. The North Korea, you know, if they intend to, if North Korea were to fight a war, their intent, or even initiate a war, which is less likely, extremely less likely, but their intent would be able to fight and win in a very condensed period of time, you know, something like 30 days. And they would, and you're right, they do have antiquated equipment, but they have significant asymmetrical capabilities, which would be used to try to seize the initiative, even without using nuclear weapons, which is not likely from an outset. But they are likely to use heavy conventional weapons in the form of artillery and rockets and missiles, chemical usage. They would clearly try to exploit with special forces, and they have a significant numbers both at tactical level and strategic level. But they would quickly try to seize control of the peninsula that would preclude the entry of forces from the U.S. They would try to block the entry of use of UNC rear bases in Japan for flow of forces, and so that would be their effort. You say, well, you know, we would bomb them. Yeah, of course we would. And we dropped more munitions in North Korea during the Korean War than we dropped in the Pacific during the Second World War. And it did not bring about the end of Korea. And so, despite the realities of antiquated conventional systems, there's at least two things I think I would take. One is they do have quantity, and they have a significant number of them. And they do have an asymmetrical capability that would bring about significant challenges in fighting over there. And so I would argue that it is in our best interest not to fight a second Korean War. And in fact, that has been the desire of the regional powers that have been over there, is that there not be a conflict in there. And so the essence of, so why these, I'm going to turn my attention, why these denuclearization agreements, right? Well, it's been because of a desire to, from the United States perspective, clearly to forestall a capability of North Korea being able to attack or affect the U.S. homeland, which is ironic because that's exactly where they are, and they were nowhere near that in the beginning. And so, in 1988, when No Tae-woo had reached out to its northern neighbors in Moscow and Pyongyang with his Nordpolitik policy, he was successful in making engagements with both of them, looking to normalize relations. By 1990, September of 1990, South Korea will normalize relations with the Soviet Union, right? And he will have success in bringing about the first agreements with North Korea. And so in December of 1991, there are two agreements that are agreed to. The Agreement on Reconciliation, Non-Aggression, and Exchanges on the 13th of December looks at trying to bring about efforts toward peaceful coexistence, toward living together peacefully, toward respecting each other's sovereignty. And then the Joint Denuclearization Declaration, which is an expansive agreement that goes further towards denuclearization than any of the agreements that have come afterwards. There are a number of things that brought that about that are significant and important. The two concessions came forward in this before this agreement was signed. One was the U.S. had unilaterally agreed to remove all of its nuclear weapons, well, remove them all back home, including those that were on the Korean Peninsula. And this was an effort to try to get the Soviet Union to do the same as they were showing instability, and it worked in that regard as well. But on the 27th of September of 91, Bush had said, hey, he signed the Presidential Nuclear Initiative to pull back tactical nuclear weapons. I was a nuclear weapons officer in Korea at the time. And this gave impetus for North Korea to bring in the IAEA. But also, we had agreed to cancel Team Spirit, which was a major force on force exercise, 200,000 plus combatants running around or maneuvering around to practice for the next Korean War. And that was terminated. As a result, this agreement was signed, and but it broke down. And it broke down after joint nuclear control committees were unable to agree upon these reciprocal inspections, and which eventually led to the restart of the March 1993 Team Spirit. And as that digressed, then the U.S. tried to engage with North Korea, successfully eventually, in October of '94 by signing the agreed framework. You know, interesting is while Kim Il-sung dies in July of '94, Kim Jong-il, his son, within the first 90 days of taking power, will sit down in an agreement with the U.S. to sign this this denuclearization agreement. This agreement, the six-party talks, and to a lesser extent the Leap Day deal, all focus on three central points, right? Normalization of political and economic relations, peace and security, and denuclearization. They have all failed to be able to bring it about. And I would suggest it's less about the policy points and more about the approach. And we can talk about more of that as we go through. I'll cut short any more discussion on this slide unless there's any questions before I go. Okay. So, you know, this issue about deterrence and containment and whether it is effective in North Korea would argue that the U.S. policy priority on the peninsula for many decades was all about containment. This was a problem that was over there, and as long as it was a problem over there, we could deal with that. And only when it became a problem that could reach the U.S. homeland did it rise in urgency. These agreements that the agreed framework in 1994, signed by the Clinton administration, seeking to put a freeze on North Korea's nuclear weapons capability. North Korea didn't have any nuclear weapons in 1994, and we and we spent a lot of time on issues that were less relevant and worried about accounting for small amounts of reprocessed plutonium that and things of such that we ended up losing a lot of momentum, and we also had counted on a belief, at least for a period of time, that North Korea would not be able to, that it would implode, particularly at the transition between Kim Il-sung and his son, Kim Jong-il. There was a prevalent belief that he would be unable to consolidate power, and that if we just waited it out, we just waited long enough, it would fall on its own. That continues for quite a while. In fact, you could argue that the Clinton administration takes no effort until the summits of 2000 to seek to try to engage with the North, and we lose a lot of time. And so, yeah, I think we thought about a containment and just holding it over there. But there are a number of lessons that North Korea took from things happening around the world. The U.S. invasion of Iraq was pretty significant in the psyche of North Korea, and of course, particularly as North Korea was labeled as one of the axis of evil. And this really forced some urgency on North Korea to develop a capability that would prevent North Korea from being vulnerable against an attack. Moving forward here real quickly. So regional leaders and interests. What
James?
is it that, yeah, please.
Hey, to that question, nuclear deterrence is my core
Yeah, go ahead,
study,
Bill.
actually.
Love to have you talk.
Yeah, no, that question is a really interesting one, Brian, because it presupposes we don't already exist in a deterrent relationship with North Korea. And the reality is that is the situation we find ourselves in. We are in a nuclear deterrent relationship with North Korea, and we will be in such a relationship for the foreseeable future. I see no way to change that. In terms of what that means for us, the history of the Cold War and nuclear deterrence shows us or informs us that when two nations possess nuclear weapons, it makes them much less likely to go to war because of the devastation those weapons can cause. But the historical record also makes it clear that given sufficiently threatening situations to core values, states will consider actions that can lead to a nuclear exchange, even with all of the attendant destruction. So it behooves us to do the only other thing we can do, which is to promote a more stable, less crisis-prone relationship. So, thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that, Bill. So the regional leaders in their interests would note that it is in all six these parties' interests not to have conflict revisit the peninsula, that the Korean Peninsula be denuclearized, that there not be a propagation of nuclear capabilities within the region, all of these which of course could occur. There are dynamics now that make it less likely that we will advance in the short term towards denuclearization. The uncertainty of a re-election in the Trump administration makes much less likely that North Korea will continue to move forward on this. That occurred with the agreed framework. When Bush took office, he was certain that the agreed framework was a bad deal. He was set on bringing it about its end. He did. Of course, we went to the six-party talks, and yet it took us a long time to get to an agreement in 2005 that was substantively no different than the 1994 agreed framework. And so, unlikely to move in that direction. I'll tell you that with last month's legislative elections in South Korea and the resounding victory of the Democratic Party, it is increasingly more likely that Moon will be succeeded by another liberal. He has 2 more years in office, and there would be 5 more years there. And so afterwards, if that were the case, which would continue to advance the type of agenda which seeks to peacefully resolve and normalize the nuclear issue on the peninsula and to normalize relations with North Korea. And so we have many more years of this. Now, what we could find ourselves in is another period of time where the U.S. and South Korea are increasingly at odds with policy approaches that causes relationship issues, and we'll talk a little bit about that, I guess, next week in that webinar. Kim's had 12 summits in 15 months during 2018 and 19, where he met 5 times with Xi, 3 times with Moon, 3 other times with Trump, and then the once with Putin. This has significantly increased his international legitimacy, allowed him to secure economic assistance. The relationship between all these parties significantly improved. Made possible the Panmunjom and Pyongyang declarations. It's now been 2 years since the former, and there was significant efforts that were undertaken when these were first realized, and I've listed a number of these things that you can kind of see have occurred. The real delimiting factor in all of this was South Korea was just stymied by sanctions to be able to do what it wanted to do in its engagement with North Korea. The U.S. and North Korea summit in Singapore laid out 4 points. The top 3 are the real core of this, and they are in an order which absolutely, from North Korea's perspective, matters. This is, and I argue that the order that they're laid in, if followed that way, becomes you achieve a denuclearization through peace, and if you follow it and if you take a different approach that the U.S. has tried with all its previous agreements, has been peace through denuclearization. Meaning we'll get peace if we denuclearize first, but the problem is that North Korea has to make themselves vulnerable by denuclearizing and hope that what follows is the type of normalization and peace that is sought, and that they don't go down the path of the Libyan model. The economic context is significant. The sanctions are severe. The latter 3 have virtually made all trade illegal in North Korea. 99% of their export revenues have been affected by the sanctions. In 2006, when this first, after the first nuclear test, in the sanctions from that, China, which represented about a little more than 1/3 of its trading partner, ended up going to the far extreme where they have great sway over the North as being its singular trading partner. Nuclear missile capabilities and warheads are significant. Before 2016, North Korea had only tested of any real consequence, anyhow, as short-range ballistic missiles, which it has some 600. But since then, it has operationally tested its medium-range ballistic missiles and its intermediate-range ballistic missiles. It has done technical tests of its ICBMs, which have put the entirety of the U.S. within range of its capabilities. Its 6th nuclear test depending on how you count it, but some counted as large as 250 kilotons. If that were the case, it'd be some 17 times as potent as that dropped on Hiroshima. The capability is quite significant. Let me leave it with this then. I see us with two futures. It's either North Korea as a nuclearized enemy state, or it's as an interim nuclearized state, which is friendly. The former is much more likely because we don't have much success in working towards the latter. But in October 2017, Dr. Graham, who is the commissioner for the EMP, Electromagnetic Pulse Commission in the U.S., testified before the Homeland Security Subcommittee. And it said that North Korea had the ability to kill 90% of Americans within 1 year. And he said that the means of doing that was to detonate nuclear munition over the U.S. homeland, bring down the entire U.S. electrical grid in a cascading effect that would have implications throughout the country. And so I thought, well, that's clearly get your attention. 90%, that's 300 million Americans that are dying. And so I thought to myself, what if the reverse was more likely? And it was just 10% of Americans. Well, that's 30 million Americans. And so any victory that comes after the death of 30 million Americans is a pirate victory at best. Bill Wieninger I've heard him tell the story on occasions. You may relay more of it, but where Castro had, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, had stated a willingness to allow the firing of the Soviets' nuclear weapons from Cuba onto the United States, even knowing that it would bring the end of Cuba. The point is, there's no upside in creating a condition where we cede power to an enemy that can take actions upon the U.S. And so I would suggest that we could actually turn this foe into a friend. And we'll talk about that during Q&A if there's interest.